But just to get us started, I wanted to talk about our own personal journey with becoming more aware of transgender lives. I think you and I are about the same age, right? And this was not necessarily something that we heard about growing up very often, or really knew people who were out and identifying this way. So I'm just curious what your personal journey has been about learning about this.
For me, I wasn't really aware of transgender friends until I was in college and then seminary. And I was taught by wonderful professors how to read scripture through an LGBTQ affirming lens, which was lovely. So really, college and seminary were my first exposures and experiences.
It can be really, it's so meaningful, I think, to start meeting people, whatever identity we're talking about, who share that identity. I know for us, when Lawrence and I started going to Orange Coast Unitarian Universalist, there was someone who started at the same time who identified as a trans woman. And so that was just really, I think it was twofold for us. One, it was an education to know somebody and hear their experiences right from their mouth. But also, we were both starting on that journey of becoming part of that congregation together. So it was great to see that congregation rise up to being who they profess to be and actually walking the talk, so to speak, which is important. I'm curious, as you're part of the Disciples of Christ, and if you could speak a little bit about what you've seen, whether in the larger denomination or within your own congregational community, about how what their journey has looked like with understanding transgender lives better.
Well, I'll start with just First Christian Fullerton and then go through the denomination. For First Christian Fullerton, they took a vote 10 years ago to be what is called in our denomination open and affirming, basically to say we welcome, not just welcome into the sanctuary, but into full membership and leadership in all branches of the church, LGBTQ plus identifying people, and that it was a public statement to say marriages for LGBTQ affirming people would be happening in this setting, although it was already happening, but it was a public statement at that point. For the denomination, at our last General Assembly, there were 2 resolutions that were adopted by the entire denomination, which basically, I mean, it's a recommendation for different congregations, but each congregation is allowed to enact that as they choose. But the resolutions were to be educating our congregations about transgender identity, transgender violence, transgender leaders, and to be more open and affirming in our congregations of transgender identities. And the evolution of that was quite a lot of workshops on violence against transgender people. I wish it had been more lifting up some of the leaders, but unfortunately that was the path. But at least it was adopted, so that was the most important thing.
Well, I think that's often where people of conscience start, is when we see something that's a horrible injustice or violence being done to a particular group, then we'll often respond in that way. So we often start at the place where people are, in the worst place, and then we go back and realize there's a whole spectrum of people's lives to affirm and appreciate. And so I think that's where what we're trying to do now is move even further into that place of celebrating the lives of people who, as I said, are right here among us, already. And I'm curious, I spoke a little bit in your service this morning about my sort of approach as what I think is a faith leader, how we need to approach this when there's so much complicated conversation. I'm curious what, ethical framework that you draw from, or what in your own Christian sense of identity, what you draw upon in order to lift up the lives of trans people.
Well, I lean a lot on my Jewish siblings. That was one of my favorite professors in seminary, was helping us understand and be true to Jewish understanding of Scripture and not to completely mess it up, as Christians often do. And so one of the things that I was taught in seminary, which I love, is that in Genesis 1, God's pronouns are they, them. And we need to affirm that and talk about that and be very comfortable with that God doesn't have pronouns. We just, of course, impose that on God, as we often do. And then one of the other things that our Jewish siblings taught us was that the first person created in the creation myth story is androgynous. And that in the Hebrew language, that being, that Adam made from clay, is a completely androgynous being, and that gender comes when God divides that being. And there's a lot of beautiful midrash written on that in the Jewish tradition, making Ish and Isha different genders from the one being that God created. So it's quite beautiful. And for me personally, from that text, I also take the idea that the image of God is in every single person, that if you have the breath of life, you have the Spirit of God in you. And no one has the right to deny that truth. No one has the right to say, oh no, you don't count. No, that the Spirit of God is in everyone. The Imago Dei, the image of God, is in each and every person. And when we honor that, we are being true to our Creator. We're being true to how we were created to be. Of course, that's quite Jewish, but also Christian at its best, I hope. And so that's at least what I try to do. And in our congregation, that's one of the things that we try to lift up too, is diversity is a gift, which I guess one of the things that I try not to harp on too much, because in our denomination, people can choose to be open and affirming or not. And so there are quite a lot of disciples churches that are not open and affirming. There are a lot of Christian churches, we all know that are not open and affirming, that are quite the opposite, actually. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in our congregation is to honor our diversity, that if you're trying really hard to make everybody the same, you're losing the flavor of life. You're missing out on the beauty of God, that the beauty of God is in so much of our creation. And the minute we try to make everybody the same, or look the same, or talk the same, or have the same identity, well, then we're missing out on the beauty of God and God's creation. And so it's one of the things that we talk about a lot, about affirming diversity and trying not to get too depressed about how many Christians are doing just the opposite. And I guess you asked one other thing. I tend to lean a lot on Scripture because that's my tradition, but one of my favorite passages in the New Testament is from First John, and it tells us that God is love, and anyone who hates doesn't know God. Literally doesn't know God, because God is love. And if you hate, if you do things that are hateful, if you condone hatred, well, then you are not living in the way of God, and you're not honoring the God in you and the God in others. And that is at least what we try to live by, what I try to live by.
Oh, great points. And I love the fact that you went back to some of the kind of origin stories and talked about the fact that this whole notion that things aren't necessarily set up in a gender binary. This is not brand new. You know, this is stuff that you can find in Native American theology. It's all over the place, and it goes way, way back. It's just we start telling stories as a society at some point, and then we all think this is the way it's always been. It's not necessarily true, and so that's an important reminder. You mentioned some of these. Some of them are evangelical communities, and there are communities across different faith traditions as well. But certainly, we're seeing a lot of that Christian nationalism, and along with that comes this kind of idea that people need to be in very particular boxes, and there isn't room for people to be outside of traditional ideas about what it means to be a particular gender identity and so on. You teased at that a little bit, but I'm just curious, how does that feel as a Christian leader to often just be lumped in with that group of people?
Well, one of the things that I talk about a lot, and we try to name and rename for ourselves, is we deserve to be lumped in. We created this monster. The reason that people quote scriptures at pride parades is because we gave them to people. We taught that crap. I'm sorry, but it is. And I think that unless we own it and say, we did this, we created this, then we will not fulfill our responsibility in fixing it. We will not fulfill our responsibility in preaching a different word and teaching a different way of being. And the only way we can do that is to continue to live how we've been taught, to continue to live with love and to respect the dignity and beauty of every single person we meet and continue to preach and teach that God is love. One of the things that in our the last OC Pride gathering, we had a booth, and as there always is, there was this one person, this one group that had a megaphone, and they were preaching hate with a megaphone. And one of the things we did, because our booth was really close to where they were, is we just surrounded the person and we just started chanting God is love, because it's our job to fix it. You know, we can't just stand there and pretend that we don't know. They're our cousins. We literally are a part of a tradition that created that, and it's up to us to put a stop to it.
That's a powerful way of looking at it, because it's it shows accountability and recognition that, again, that none of us are operating alone. And we've talked about how Unitarian Universalism, as many wonderful things as we've done over the years, there have been places that we could have done better. We could have done better around race at certain points in time. We could have done better around a lot of things. And I think that is that reckoning with the truth of a faith community and its tradition is one of the ways that, you have a healthy faith in your life, rather than a faith that is based on smoke and mirrors. It's just a house of cards, essentially. Another thing we've talked about a little bit this morning is the idea of celebrating trans lives. And I'm curious, what do you think we're just hearing so many things about trans people. I don't know how much you're paying attention to the news lately with some of the conservative conferences and things that are going on, but trans people are really being demonized in those places. I mean, they really are being set up as the enemy. And I've heard that same rhetoric used for all kinds of groups over the years. You can look in the history books and certainly find that same rhetoric used for groups that predate my existence. And I'm just wondering, what do we think justice looks like right now for trans people? Because it's wonderful to have this celebration this morning, and I think this is just a beginning. But what can we do out in the world that will look and feel like justice for trans people? That's a big question for you, but I'll just throw it at you and see what you have to say.
Well, I think our responsibility as individuals is to be advocates for what we know to be right and true, and to not just practice our faith in this space, but most importantly, out beyond these walls. And so reaching out to our trans friends and letting them know that we stand in solidarity with them, calling our elected officials and saying we don't want those things on our ballots, and we will vote against any kind of exclusive or anything that denies rights to anyone. That is a massive responsibility, I think, of all individuals, any voting age person in our country, but especially the faith community, because, as I said already, I mean, I know Unitarian Universalists, you can at least take a step aside and say, you Christians, this is your circus. It's true. But if we all stand in solidarity, we can make a lot of good things happen. We certainly saw that with the homelessness crisis here in Fullerton, when the entire faith community worked together, when we all marched around the city hall in our white shirts, and we told them we absolutely wanted something other than the armory. It had to be something better. We made it happen. And when we showed up and said, no, this city is a safe sanctuary city, and it will remain that way, it stayed that way. And it was the faith community that organized that made that happen. And so I think when we work together, and we're not afraid of each other, and we know that we have allies, that's certainly why you all are here. We've worked so much with you that we wanted to share worship space with you, and it makes me and our congregation so happy every time we see you all here, and we're so excited that we can have this partnership, not just out there, but also in our building as well.
Well said. And I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this morning, is just to affirm that, this isn't necessarily something that we could have done in this way in maybe another place that this congregation has been in the past. We're able to do this in this place because we do share these values, and we are lifting up the importance of not just speaking up for the marginalized, but getting out there and doing the work that it takes to make sure that there is that form of justice for people who need it. And yeah, I think it's I don't know, it's just a very difficult time we live in, because everything is pushing us to be separate. Even people who would be partners, it's easy to fall into our separateness. And yet, as we see, we are, and this is just one way that we are connected so deeply to what we're talking about this morning. We could do this with anything that we talk about and realize that we are so profoundly connected to everybody and everything, even when it feels like we're just out here floating in the wind alone. I guess as my last question, I'm just curious, I'm curious about trans justice. It's becoming a bigger conversation. But sometimes these things can feel like they are their own thing. But I think there are broader implications for the work that we do, that we're not just necessarily working for one group of people when we do this work, that it has a broader implication to creating justice in the world and affirming and fulfilling our call as people of faith. What do you feel like it does beyond just helping transgender people when we do this work? What does it do for us, for the world, for the community?
Well, I think anytime we can work together and get behind a social justice cause, we evolve as people of faith, we evolve as individuals, we become more accepting and more understanding and more curious. And I think a lot of the, like you, as we started, you said, well, when were you first exposed to this? And both of us, it certainly wasn't when we were children. I wish it had been. But the fact that both of us were adults when we were exposed to people who were transgender, or even the concept of transgender or not people being gender binary, we evolved ourselves, and our faith evolved and grew, and we became more curious, and we became more involved in social justice movements because of what we learned. And I think that is upon all of us, that we have to continue to stretch and grow and learn and challenge ourselves. One of my favorite things that came from the pandemic, there's an awful lot that we didn't like, of course, but one of the things that came from the pandemic was our congregation invested in anti-racism studies, and because we were severely lacking in that, we hadn't done that. And we started reading anti-racism books, and we started watching anti-racism documentaries, everything from Ibram Kendi to all sorts of different authors. And we've been doing it for 3 years and haven't stopped. And one of the things that we've kept saying to ourselves is there's so much more to learn. There's so many ways to stretch ourselves and to grow. And there's so many more alliances that we can build with different groups that we honest to goodness weren't even aware existed. And I think that's a big part of being a person of faith. It's a big part of being a human who believes in working with others and loving other people, is that you have to constantly stretch yourself and grow and learn new things. And if you're not, well, then there's an awful lot you're missing out on.
Oh, it's very well said, and I think it's so true. It's all connected. The work we're doing with reproductive justice, the lunch we're having today for that, is connected to Transgender Day of Visibility, is connected to the work of anti-racism. It all is connected, and it's all actually part of the same thing, even though, again, the tendency is to see, that it's over here and over there and separate. It's all actually part of that great big interconnected web.
And then it doesn't have to be so overwhelming. It doesn't have to feel like
Right.
you have to be an advocate for 100 different things. You're an advocate for loving everyone
Right.
and working for justice,
Yeah.
however it presents itself. And then it doesn't have to be so overwhelming. And you certainly don't have to have all the right words and know all the right things. You just, hey, I'm working for justice and I'm trying to love everybody.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And we do what we can with the resources that we have. Shall we thank Reverend Dr. Mandye Yates?